second video in our series about the 8 limbs of yoga. So we're talking about all the different components that make up the practice of yoga. And of course the public perception or the aspect of yoga that's always visible are the asanas, the postures that are practiced, because that's the really flashy kind of pictures that you see everywhere and the things that you see on the cover of magazines. But the less flashy version of or components of yoga are the underpinning or the philosophy that creates the meaning behind why we do all of these different components to our practice. So when we start studying the 8 limbs of yoga, it just puts a little bit more perspective on the fact that yoga as a practice of doing postures is just looking at 1/8 of that puzzle. But for this board today, we're talking about the second limb on that 8-limbed tree of the practice of yoga. And the second limb consists of the NIYAMAS. And the NIYAMAS are these guidelines that tell us what we should be doing. And when we look back at the first limb, at the yamas had a very external focus. It's guidelines about how we are expected to conduct ourselves in the environment, in the community, how we're expected to interact with the people and the other things around us. Where the niyamas turn a little bit more inwardly, and they have a stronger component of our relationship with ourselves and how we take care of ourselves, how we conduct ourselves. It's also spun in a little bit more of a positive light. If you think back to the yamas are usually framed in a negative way, as in non-violence or non-lying or non-stealing, telling us what not to do. And the niyamas are a little bit different. This is what's telling you that you should do. So we call these the yeses, and the yamas are the no's. So the niyamas, there's 5 of them, just like the yamas. The first one is saucha, and saucha means cleanliness. And we can think of cleanliness as a practice of making sure that you bathe on a regular basis and you're taking care of your physical body, because that in itself can be a really strong component of your self-care. When you're taking a shower, when you're washing your face, thinking about that as something very much like a ritual that you're performing as a way of showing gratitude for the body that you have, for the health that you have, and for being alive. But it's cleanliness that goes on to a deeper level. So watching your internal dialogue, trying to keep that clean, watching the way specifically that you speak to yourself, the way that you create thought patterns around the things that are happening outside of you, watching that to try to keep that clean. Then the next one is Santosha, and Santosha is such a great one because it's the practice of contentment. It's really what we all striving for. We all want to be happy. We all want to feel content. We don't like the lows that come through that roller coaster of those peaks and valleys. So contentment is this practice of no matter what comes, no matter how this journey unfolds, I am going to be content with the way that things are happening. Which is very challenging because we always have these predictions or these hopes about how we want things to unfold, and then when it doesn't match up, we end up in one of those valleys. We have this period of suffering. So contentment is this practice of letting things be exactly as they are without trying to exert our own control over them and being just as happy no matter what happens. The next of the niyamas is tapas, and tapas is transformation. We think of it as a fiery, challenging process of transformation. And I kind of like to pair tapas with svadhyaya. So svadhyaya is self-study, which is such a core central element in what yoga does for us and the tools that yoga gives us to self-reflect and to look at the way that we physically carry our body, the way that our thought process unfolds, the way that we interact with the people around us, the choices that we make in terms of our diet, in terms of the clothing that we wear and the house that we live in, the resources that we consume. All of those things can be elements of self-study, watching how you conduct yourself every day. And then based on what you find and how that matches up with what yoga teaches us about the yamas and the niyamas, that if we're on this path of yoga, how we're trying to conduct ourselves. So we're seeing if our choices, if our behavior and our decisions are matching up with that, or if there's a discrepancy. So if we find that there is a discrepancy there, then what is the process to go through to create change or to create transformation? So that brings us back to tapas. And we know that when we have a habit and we want to change that habit, it is an uncomfortable transition to change that habit, to create a new pattern. So that's where that transformation by fire comes in. We have to do something different and something challenging so that we can start to change the pattern that we've recognized through self-study. But you see self-study as being the root of this process. If we don't have the awareness of what's happening, then we can't take the next step to make an effort toward change. So the awareness from self-reflection and self-study through our practice is the first step of that. And when we do an asana practice, when we're on our mat and we're doing our hatha practice, the challenging positions that we put ourselves in are places where our stuff, our issues, are going to rise up. So, for example, if you're in a group class and they call a certain pose, and maybe it's a pose that you can't do well, maybe it's a split. They're doing the full Hanumanasana split, and you have tight hamstrings like me, and you can't do a full split. So you watch the thought process that comes up. You're in a modified pose. Maybe everybody else in the room can do a split. And you watch what happens in your mind. And all of a sudden your brain starts thinking, man, I'm not good at yoga. Why don't I do yoga more often? I'm so undisciplined. I really need to stretch those hamstrings more. They're so tight. I spend too much time sitting. Why do I have to drive so much? I'm always in the car. And it creates this whole ripple effect. And your brain is off in a direction. And the learning process of that is when you snap into that space of self-study and you become the observer and you're watching this whole process unfold of the mind going through these judgments and jumping to these conclusions. And then you can say to yourself, okay, even if I'm not able to do this pose the way that everybody else in the class is doing it, and I'm taking this modified version of the pose, I can still go into the same exact inner space of focusing on my breath, of having clarity, of having gratitude for what my body is able to do in this moment, rather than going down that rabbit hole of judgment and difficult feelings because you're at a different place in your practice. So that's just an example of how our posture practice is going to kind of stir things up. It can really be an uncomfortable process sometimes, and that discomfort is all part of the transformation of being able to recognize what's happening and then address it accordingly. So a really nice relationship between tapas and svadhyaya. But then talking about our last one, our fifth niyama, is Ishvara Pranidhana. And this is the process of surrender, but most specifically, it's a spiritual aspect of surrender. It's a surrender to whatever you know your higher power to be. And I like to keep a very clear separation whenever I'm crossing that realm of talking about yoga and talking about whatever your concept of God or a higher power is. It's an open-ended statement. You get to insert whatever your concept or your relationship with a higher power is. It's not specified. So don't feel like you're excluded if you belong to a certain religion or a certain spiritual practice. This is something that you can layer on top of whatever you personally follow. But this is a great place where if you do have a personal concept of what your higher power is, or maybe even if you don't and you're still trying to figure out what that is, this is your space to explore that, of letting there be a surrender to watching your life unfold, watching that story unfold and seeing what happens, or being able to surrender in a posture. Maybe it's a restorative pose, and a lot of people find it difficult to be still. we're in perpetual motion. We put out a huge amount of effort during the day. You have different events that cause stress and create tension in your body. So when you get to a point where you're asked to be completely still, but 100% alert and aware of what's going on in your body, it can be really uncomfortable. So the process of surrendering and being still in a restorative pose or in a yin pose can really challenge you. But it's also a space where the transformation can be immensely strong, because you can pass that threshold of being uncomfortable with being still and being very aware into that space of being able to surrender and being comfortable with it. So a lot of challenging concepts when we're talking about the niyamas, and I always find it interesting when, especially with the yamas, but a little bit with the niyamas, when you take these things at face value, that you think, okay, that's pretty easy. Like I can practice cleanliness. I'm going to make sure that I take care of my physical body, and I'm going to watch my internal state for negativity or things that are going to tarnish that internal state that I have. I'm going to try to be content with whatever happens. And at face value, you think, okay, I can do all of these things, but when you really start to implement it and put it into your life and put it into your yoga practice, that's where you'll start to see challenges coming up all the time. And you're just going to recognize that that's a challenge to your practice of contentment, or that's a challenge to your practice of svadhyaya, of self-study. So the way that I like to pull these things into my practice to really give myself something concrete to hold on to is to connect it to the practice of postures, to bring it into our hatha practice. So I tend to select a certain thing in my hatha practice that I feel like embodies each of these niyamas or each of the yamas, and then create a practice that's focused on that specific thing. Like for Santosha, heart opening. That just makes sense to me, that if I'm trying to be content, I have to be connected to that fullness that I have in the heart. And for the practice of tapas or transformation, it's that fiery strengthening and building heat in the core. For self-study, it's a practice of watching your posture, because posture is such a deeply ingrained habit. A lot of times we're not even aware of the way that we hold our body, the way that we habitually move our body. So focusing on posture is a great way to subtly shine the light of self-awareness onto your physical body. And then for Ishvara Pranidhana, for surrender, it's restorative poses and longer holds, using props, being able to let go and have the props support you. And for cleanliness, it's a process of working with your breath, because the breath is that process. It's almost like it washes the body. Every time you inhale and exhale, there's this washing process with the body. And one of the really cleansing things that we'll do in our practice is the open mouth exhale, the exhale, so that we're pressing everything out from really deep down in the belly. But the practice that I've been really slightly obsessed with this week is not even a yoga practice, but it's a movement system that I came across through another yoga teacher. It was actually through the podcast that I listened to, which is Yoga Body. And during the podcast, the host Lucas was talking about a movement system that he had used to heal some lower back pain that he had chronically been dealing with. So it's a movement system called foundation training. And it was created by a chiropractor named Dr. Goodman. And he himself had been having lower back pain, and he created this really interesting system of working on the posterior chain muscles. So the posterior chain muscles are the muscles that go down the back of the body. Think of the upper back muscles, the lower back muscles, the glutes, the hamstrings, the calves, and even the plantar surface of the foot, that plantar fascia that tends to get a bad rap from getting plantar fasciitis. But these are muscles that you're going to notice that we have a lot of issues with. Lower back pain, upper back weakness from rounding, tightness in the hips, tightness in the hamstrings, and then all sorts of fascial issues down into the feet. So it's an area that obviously our movement systems normally are not serving these muscles well. So this practice of foundation training focuses on firing those muscles up and creating a good connection from the mind to those muscles so that we know how to activate them when we're lifting things, when we're moving from posture to posture, when we're in positions like standing and sitting, we know how to fire up the muscles that are going to give us good posture. So I found this movement system very, very interesting, especially because many of the movements mirror a lot of things that we do, or it's very close to things that we do in our yoga practice, with some very slight changes in alignment and the breath work, so that it is super targeted on specific muscles depending on what movement you're doing. So it translated really well into a regular yoga practice. So I think it's something that I'm going to personally pull into my practice, because I know the lower back and the upper back are areas that I'm always trying to target more because of our habitual movement patterns of driving and working on the computer. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. And I'm going to work on putting a practice together so that you guys can see how well this practice of foundation training and yoga tie together, and how beneficial that can be to making your physical body stronger so that you're more able to do whatever it is you have to do during the day without pain. So thank you so much for joining me for our second yoga board about the 8 limbs of yoga, the NIYAMAS, and I will see you for the next one. Namaste.